My name is Peng, and I am a professor of sociology and public policy at the University of Toronto in Canada. I work and teach in the areas of political sociology and social policy, and I focus my research and teaching on family, gender, care, and migration issues. So in this session today, we will follow on the previous sessions and switch gears a bit and focus on the political economy of care and care work. I will start today's session by going over a couple of key conceptual frameworks that we could use to analyze care and care work, and to understand how care and care work connects individuals and families to various social, economic, and political institutions such as the community, market, government, and policies. So, and in the second part of the session, Ana Maria Trivin will focus more specifically on social, labor, and care policies. So, in the next hour or so, I would like to accomplish the following 5 things. First, I want to spend a few minutes to talk about the concept of the care diamond and how we could use this concept to analyze political economy of care. Second, I will discuss how the concept of care diamond needs to be overlaid with the intersectionality and multi-scalar lenses. And by this, I mean, how do we bring in race, ethnicity, class, and other social locations and local to global dimensions to our analysis. And then in the third part of my lecture, I will use South Korea as a case study to show how we can use the concept of care diamond to understand the shape, size, and the dynamics of its care infrastructure and how it has changed over time. In the fourth section, I will discuss how South Korea's current care policies and infrastructure translate to paid care workers or caregivers and the market for care. Here, I will bring in the intersectionality lens more clearly. So hopefully, this lecture will take about 40 minutes. And at the end of the session, I would like to pose a couple of discussion questions, or we could open up for Q&A for us to discuss in a larger group. So at this point, as it has been pointed out in the previous sessions this week, social and political organizations of care and unequal gender division of paid and unpaid care work within households and in the labor market are influenced by a variety of factors. And one of the key factors shaping this is the social and cultural norms that serves as a set of beliefs, attitudes, and expectations about what constitute men, what constitute women, and what are acceptable roles and behaviors for women and men. What's interesting is that across the globe, and of course across the cultures, there seem to be pretty consistent social norms about men's so-called paid economic role and women's unpaid caring role. So not surprisingly, when we look at the Time News surveys that we have discussed yesterday, we find that pretty well across the world, women take on a significantly greater share of unpaid care work compared to men. While of course in many high-income countries such as Canada or US, total amount of time women spend on doing unpaid care work has declined over the last couple of decades. And in some countries, men have even also increased their time spent on unpaid care work a little bit. But still, overall, women continue to spend greater amount of time doing unpaid care work than men. Clearly, deeply entrenched social and cultural norms about women's primary care role remains very pervasive. And we could see this in both implicit and explicit media representations of ideotypical images of women as like caring mothers, nurturing sisters or friends on the one hand, and on the other, men's kind of strong, dependable role as a father or a successful businessman. But social norms are not the only thing that shape our ideas and expectations about gender and gender roles. Policies, institutions, and institutional practices are also powerful forces that shape gender roles and expectations about what care is, who should care for whom, how, when, and where. These policies and institutional practices can come in explicit forms, such as government providing universal public child care or employers offering flexible working hours to their employees, or they could come in implicit forms, such as government not having policies on child care. In other words, being silent on the issue of child care, or employers allowing their workers to, of course, take maternity and parental leaves because that's required by law, but giving them low evaluations for taking these leaves. Whereas policies such as universal public childcare shows the state or the government's explicit aim to support the family by providing or funding public childcare services, having no policy on childcare is still a policy, except that this policy is about not supporting the family through childcare. The implications of this implicit no childcare policies are, among others, that the state sees and expects the family, meaning women, to be the primary carer for their children. So when we look at the issue of care, we need to look at it from a systemic point of view. Here, many researchers who work in the field of comparative social policy and welfare states argue that welfare state policies explicitly and implicitly structure and institutionalize gender roles and gender relations by creating incentives and disincentives for individuals and families to decide who should provide care and how that care should be provided. Let me give you a more concrete example. In Canada, there was a federal election in 2006. One of the most debated policy issues in that election was childcare. Just before the election, the Liberal Party, which was in power, made universal national childcare policy one of its policy platforms. This was because by 2006, the labor force participation rate of Canadian women aged between 25 and 54 had increased to 82%. And women's groups were raising the lack of affordable quality childcare as one of the greatest barriers for working mothers in maintaining their careers. The Liberal Party, which is actually left of center party in Canada, proposed to implement a universal national childcare in response to this call. They framed it as a progressive policy to support women and family. Now, the opposition party, their main opposition party, the Conservative Party, however, was dead set against this policy. But while they were totally against universal public childcare, they also didn't want to appear as if they were not supporting the family. In fact, the Conservatives were positioning themselves as the party that stands for the family values, except their vision of the family was the traditional heterosexual family with clear gender division of labor. So instead, they proposed to introduce a child care allowance of $600 a year per child for all families with children under the age of 16. Incidentally, the cost of full-time public preschool childcare in Canada at that time was anywhere between $3,000 to $7,000 a year per child. So an allowance of $600 a year was just a drop in the bucket. Both parties claimed that they wanted to support the family. But what they see, what you see here are two very different versions of the family, the gender roles and gender relations. With the Liberal Party envisioning a family consisted of two adult earners with a child or children, with government helping the family externalize and commodify their unpaid care work through universal national public child care program. In contrast, the Conservative Party was envisioning traditional heterosexual family with a male breadwinner husband and family carer wife, with the government providing compensation for the wife's unpaid childcare work with a $600 a year allowance. What this example shows is that policies explicitly and implicitly structure gender roles and gender relations by creating the different kinds of incentives and conditions for individuals and families to arrange who will provide care, how that care should be provided, and where that care should be provided. And once the policies are set in place and implemented, they further serve as institutional template to guide and regulate individual and families about what are the appropriate gender roles for men and women. So a larger systems perspective beyond social norms is important to understand and analyze care. This means we need to really understand care as being produced, provided, and financed by different key social, political institutions or actors. So this brings me to the care diamond. Oops, wrong direction. Okay, this is a schematic diagram of the care diamond. As Shara Razavi, whose reading is required for today's session, points out in her report on political and social economy of care, we can conceptualize care diamond as the architecture through which care is provided. As illustrated here, Razavi, thank you. Razavi considers care diamond as being produced, provided, and financed by four key institutions: the family, the state, market, and community and not-for-profit sector. We know that almost every country, the family is the main provider of care, whether it is childcare, elder care, or disability care, and that much of this care is provided in the form of unpaid caregiving. But care is also provided by the state, either through direct or indirect service provisions, such as public childcare, hospitals, nursing homes, or in forms of financial support, such as care allowances and tax credits. Market is also an important provider of care services, an employer of care workers. In many countries, care is now increasingly provided by the market. This is partly because of policy changes. So for example, many countries have adopted what is often referred to as the social investment policies, the policies that sees public investment in care, particularly in childcare, as a win-win strategy for both social and economic development. The argument here is that investing in childcare will not only result in human capital development that's so much needed for the 21st century economy, but also it would immediately generate employment, particularly women for women in the care sector. So these social investment type policies have resulted in increased transfer of hitherto unpaid care work from the family to the market and community in the forms of commodified or paid care work. The outsourcing of the family's unpaid care work has in turn led to the expansion of both the market and community roles in providing care and in increased marketization of care. Here, I should also point out that the market, in fact, is not made of, actually made of quite diverse set of actors that ranges from for-profit business to not-for-profit social enterprises, and from small local businesses to large multinational corporations. When we say that care has become increasingly marketized, what we mean is that as the market for care expands and where the government regulation is weak, there is an increasing trend toward large multinational for-profit corporations to enter and begin to take over the share of the care market. And this is because they have institutional competitive advantages to do this. Finally, community and NGO sector are also important actors in the provision and shaping of the care economy. As I just said before, the increased outsourcing of care work from the family to outside of the family has led to expansion of both market and community roles in care provision. The community, such as charities and other local and national nonprofit social welfare organizations, have always provided care for those people who have no families to rely on, or for people who cannot afford private care services. But with the shift to social investment policies, many governments are now not only simply facilitating the expansion of the market for the for-profit care businesses, but also encouraging nonprofits and community sectors to provide care. And this is because they are cheaper options option for the government than to use for-profit care providers. So, putting this together, when we look at care and care work from systems point of view, we see that these four key sectors form an architecture through which care is produced, provided, and financed. Having said that, it's also important to understand three things. First, these four institutions are distinct but not separate or disconnected entities. Rather, their boundaries, the boundaries between these institutions are quite permeable and sometimes even overlap with each other. So for example, boundaries between market and communities are sometimes blurred as they often provide similar or same services within the same care market, and some NGOs or community organizations might behave like for-profit businesses. Second, that care diamond varies depending on social, economic, political, and cultural contexts. I think that both Paula and Nancy have mentioned this point before. So for example, the shape, the size, the configurations of the care diamond in Canada is very different from that of, say, Colombia or South Korea or Senegal. And third, and finally, care diamond is also not static. Rather, it's a dynamic political economic process that changes over time as social, economic, political, and cultural contexts change, and as the configuration and the arrangements are being constantly negotiated and contested by the different actors. So for example, the shape of the care diamond in Canada back in, say, 1970, when many families had male breadwinner, full-time housewives, and there was not much in way of public child care. That care diamond is very different from today, where in some provinces in Canada, there is universal public child care, and most of the families are made up of 2 adult workers. So just to recap these points, here are the examples of what different types of care diamonds might look like. One on the left exemplifies what may be called the state-oriented care diamond, where the state or the government plays a large role in providing and financing care. And the one on the right exemplifies what may be called a market-oriented care diamond, where the market plays a large role in providing care. Again, of course, the shape, size, and configurations of care diamond will depend on the social, economic, political, and cultural context of a country or region. And again, these institutions are not all separate and discrete, so they may overlap with each other and change over time. This slide actually just summarizes the point I just made about the different constituents or the institutions that make up the care diamond. I don't think I will belabor this point, so I'll skip this and move to the next slide. Here, I want to also suggest that we apply our analysis of the care diamond using the intersectionality and multi-scalar lenses. This has been already mentioned in the previous presentations this week, but I want to reiterate the importance of the intersectional and multi-scalar perspectives to analyzing care and care work. As we've seen, the COVID pandemic has highlighted not only the importance of care and care work and its gendered nature, but it has also underscored multi-dimensional inequalities along the race, ethnicity, class, age, citizenship, non-citizenship status, and other social locations lines. What it tells us is that the impact of the pandemic are complex and different for different groups of people, and that this complexity and differences are quite systematic and closely aligned to how our societies and economies are structured. So as Patricia Collins noted, by applying the intersectionality lens, we can see how different identities and social locations don't just operate separately on their own, but rather they work together to create and shape a set of complex social inequalities that in themselves need to be examined. So in our analysis of care and care work, we want to use the intersectionality lens to show how different identities, locations, and status interact with each other to produce and reproduce power relations and power structures that are reflected in care and care work. To this, we also need to add a multi-scalar lens, because when we talk about care and care work, we can't limit our analysis to a single location or geography, but we need to connect and scale it up from local to global contexts. This is because this has become increasingly relevant in recent years because care work is becoming increasingly globalized and interconnected through the outsourcing of care. That in turn has become increasingly reliant on the global care worker supply chain. Now, this global care worker supply chain is not only playing out in the forms of the traditional global care chain that people like Ollie Hochschild or Rachel Perenas or Nicola Yates and other colleagues have talked about, but also in terms of the entry and expansions of the multinational global organizations and other new actors who are making the global care market increasingly competitive and less flexible. So now let me tell you the story of South Korea. This is now the storytelling time, right? South Korea as an example of how its care economy has changed over the years from the perspective of care diamond and intersectionality. So sit down and listen to this story. So South Korea has been widely considered as one of the most familiaristic male breadwinner welfare state. What it means is that in Korea, social welfare and social policies were traditionally considered as subsidiary to economic development, and therefore not a priority for the government. And as such, care and welfare has traditionally been considered the family responsibility, and there were very little in way of child care or elder care or any kind of care policies to support the family. The government's main concern at that time and their priorities, particularly during the post-Korean War economic growth period, so that's after 1960s, was to focus on the export-led industrialization strategy by strategically investing in key industrial sectors with an assumption that that will result in high employment for men who will in turn earn adequate wages to support their families, while women provide unpaid care work at home. This familiaristic expectation of women's unpaid care within the household meant that there were very little in way of market role in care services, nor were there much in way of the community-based care services, as those were limited to care provided by religious groups and charities for people without families. So in terms of the care diamond, it looked something like this. On the left-hand side, pre-2000 era. This was more or less a picture of the South Korea, right, until the end of 1980s. Oh, by the way, I should also mention that during this time, between 1965 and 1987, Korea was under military dictatorship. So this was an authoritarian regime. Then a few important things happened. First, Korea, during the high economic growth, over the high economic growth period, became rich. Its export-led industrialization policy really worked. The country's national and per capita GDP grew at a sort of rapid speed. By the beginning of the 1990s, Korea had become a middle to high income country, owing to the success of its electronic and auto industries, something that people like Joseph Stiglitz and his colleagues at the World Bank referred to as one of the Asian economic miracles. And with the economic growth, increased public education, and increased globalization in the 1980s, Korean people began to agitate. Led by students and labor unions, they began to push for political democratization. And in 1987, it finally led to what relatively peaceful transition from authoritarianism to democracy. Korea's democratic transition was then immediately followed by fierce electoral contestations. And interestingly, much of that contestation was between what is called the Growth Coalition, a more conservative political force that were more interested in economic growth at any cost on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Welfare Coalition, a political force that really wanted more equality and social welfare. As the political contestation between these two political forces continued in 1990s, another important thing happened. You know what it is? In 1997 and 98, Asian financial crisis happened. This threw some of the new growing Asian economies, including Korea, into tailspin. With the collapse of the currency, foreign debt to GDP ratio shot up, and South Korea had to ask the IMF for emergency rescue package to save its economy from collapsing. The IMF rescue package came with conditionalities that included the government to implement a radical restructuring of financial sector and the labor market. This in turn led to business closures and layoffs and a large number of male suicides. And within a year, the conservative government that represented the institutions that supported the old authoritarian regime lost the presidential election and were swept out by the new government that represented the labor and civil society coalition groups. This government, led by Kim Dae-jung, then began a huge social welfare expansion, largely really to save the people who were caught in the financial crisis. The new government introduced universal pension, employment insurance, and workers' compensation, really to build the government's social security system. These happened between 1998 and 2003. And Korea was very fortunate in that they were able to recover from the Asian financial crisis within a few years. So within 10 years of achieving its political democracy, South Korea gets hit by the Asian financial crisis and had to restructure its financial and welfare systems. But the crisis didn't stop there. No sooner than the country gets itself out of the Asian financial crisis, another crisis hit. This time, it was a demographic crisis, low fertility and demographic aging. The total fertility rate in Korea had been dropping since the 1980s, but by 2005, it had dropped down to 1.08, then the lowest fertility recorded in the country's history, and way below the replacement rate of 2.1. As Nancy pointed out in her lecture on Tuesday, this is a way out of line low fertility. What it meant was that this will directly lead to population aging and at pretty rapid rate too, which in turn meant that there will be a growing need for elderly care, while the proportion of working age population will continue to shrink. And of course, in the long run, if the low fertility continues, Korea will face eventual population decline. By the way, do you know what the current total fertility rate of South Korea is? Last year, in 2020, it was 0.84. In fact, the total fertility rate of South Korea has been dipping down below 1.0 since 2018. And there's an ongoing joke in Korea that Koreans are now one of the endangered species because at the rate it's going, there might not be any Koreans left on this planet by the end of this century. Anyway, what I want to say is that because of these various shocks, politics in Korea has been in a bit of a dizzy over the last couple of decades. And with each election, social welfare and care policies have been one of the top policy issues, with both the conservative and progressive parties promising more social care expansions. So now in Korea, there is free universal childcare for all preschool age children, and there is a universal national long-term care insurance for older people. And the process of these social care expansions, and in the process of the social care expansions, the government has opened up the market for both for-profit and not-for-profit providers to enter and to provide care services. So now the care diamond in South Korea looks something like this. Oops. On the right-hand side. Yeah, so it's now much better sort of arranged. But what about care workers and market for care? Now, this is the interesting part. As you saw from the diagram of the care diamonds, South Korea's care diamond has changed quite a bit over the last few decades because of the various political, economic, and social demographic crises. As each of these crises shakes up the society and changes people's thinking and behaviors, what we see is a shift from family-centered care diamond to a more balanced family, state, market, and community-oriented care diamond. This looks pretty good. It seems to suggest that the family is finally able to redistribute its excess unpaid care work to other sectors of the society. And as care is being redistributed to the state, market, and community, you would think that there might be opportunities for more gender equality. But when we look at who are the care workers, you realize that there are continuing pervasive inequalities. We know from our studies in Korea that paid care workers are, first of all, overwhelmingly women, whereas childcare work is dominated by women in their 20s and 30s, most of them unmarried. Long-term care workers work is dominated by women in their 50s and 60s, post-child rearing period. Paid care work in South Korea, like any other countries, is also low wage, low status, and precarious. And not surprisingly, there is a very high turnover rate. Because paid care work is not something that most women or men want to get into, there is an increasing use of migrant co-ethnic workers, particularly in the long-term care sector. So for example, we know that a significant proportion of informal paid long-term care workers in South Korea today are migrant co-ethnic women from China, the group they call Joseonjoks. But because it's also getting even difficult for families to hire Joseonjok to do care work, there is now a growing interest in developing policies to recruit and hire foreign migrant care workers from abroad, mainly from lower income Asian countries such as the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. What about the care market? Well, the successive governments in Korea have expanded care policies and public financing of care. The governance and regulations on care providers in the market remains quite inadequate. In fact, in some ways, the government has actually been really reluctant to enforce too much regulation on the for-profit care providers because it wants to expand the care market, and it wants both the for-profit and not-for-profit providers to provide care on a competitive basis, which in turn means it keeps the cost of the care low. This in turn points to the fact that the Korean government is constantly trying to balance, on the one hand, the public demand for more care, and on the other, the employer and business demand for market expansion and flexibility. And unfortunately, the government is still kind of trapped in that old business and economy first mindset, which is creating a huge barrier to achieving fair and sustainable care economy and gender equality. So this is to say, while South Korean government has made a huge progress in expanding its welfare state and in social care, it is also really caught in a tension between care on the one hand and economy on the other. And this has resulted in a serious mismatch between policies and the realities of care and care work. So I will stop here and kind of, I actually wrote this sort of PowerPoint before last week. And what surprised me was that my question was same as one of the questions that Nancy had raised in her session, but didn't get discussed. So let's open it to for discussion, and shall we? So I will stop sharing my screen and let's open for discussion.
Thanks. So I'm going to start. My name is Ana Maria Trivin, and I am currently working at UNDP for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm going to talk today about social labor and care policies. I'm going to start giving you some context with some statistics to show you the disparities. And then I'm going to go deeper into the literature that analyzes the policies that try to reduce all these disparities, especially in those related with reducing and redistributing care, also the ones that are aimed to reduce all the barriers that we face at labor places, and also some policies that aim to change some social norms. So let's start. Inequality between men and women is present in every sphere, especially in the labor market and within the households. Since these two environments are intrinsically related, then thinking about gender equality, we have to address these two spheres simultaneously. Let's think about what is happening nowadays with the pandemic. The governments are eager to promote women employment. But at the same time, we have this crisis in the education sector and the schools are closed. So it's impossible for a lot of women to start working. So you have to address these two at the same time. Worldwide, in one hand, women face gaps in all the outcomes in the paid labor market. And on the other hand, women carry out domestic and care tasks unequally, even if they are the primary providers within a household. Let's start with some stylized facts. Here we have female participation. The ratio is always, this ratio between female to male labor force participation is always below 100%, which means that the participation of women tends to be lower than the participation of men. Yet difference between countries are outstanding. If we look at the Middle East and North Africa, it is around 30%. Latin America and the Caribbean is nearly 60%, and Sub-Saharan Africa is nearly 80%. The country with the highest participation rate of female is Rwanda, with 86%. The intuition behind this is a bit shocking, but the economic literature has found that events such as wars can increase the participation of women in the labor market. The mass killing and the raping of hundreds of thousands of people in Rwanda during 1994, but allowed women to band together to demand power, and they were very successful, not only in the labor market, also in the political arena. Therefore, women organizations and advocacy could play a big role for their empowerment. Let's see the trends of employment. We have here the employment for men, women, and the gap. Over the past 27 years, the gender employment gap has shrunk by less than 2 percentage points. This means that we still have a consistent gender gap of around 26 to 28 percentage points that persists since 1991. So there has been little improvement in this area. Now we will discuss differences between men and women participation by the economic sector. Here we can observe the share of male versus women employed in the industry sector. Most of the countries, as you can see here, are clustered above the 45-degree line, showing that worldwide industry is on average male dominated. For the service sector, we have a different story. We can see more dispersion, and now the countries, most of the countries are below the 45-degree line. This graph shows that the service sector is more intensive in female labor. So we have a segregated labor market. This is that since you're born, your sector is almost determined by your sex, no matter your skills. That is shocking for me. Unemployment. Let's move to unemployment. Although unemployment in some countries remains equal for men and women, most of the countries are located above the 45-degree line. Keep in mind here that the y-axis now counts for the unemployment rate for women, showing a higher unemployment rate for women than men. So summing up, worldwide we have worse outcomes for women in labor for participation, employment, unemployment compared to men. We also have a wage pay gap. The pay gap discouraged women from participating in the labor market. In this graph, we show that in all countries, without exception, women earn less income than men. Even in the developed countries, this trend persists. And also there's literature showing the same pay gap controlling for all observables. So you're looking for people that are similar, and you still find a pay gap. Women earn less than men. Well, let's see if the problem is related with the access to the education. There's a strong relation between education and labor market outcomes. Lower education fosters worse labor outcomes for individuals. Nevertheless, if we see this table that shows the year of birth of the first cohort in which the gender education gap closed, we can see that the education gap has not only closed, but also reversed in a lot of countries. So women do not get the same employment returns as men in education. Education is key to achieve equality, but education by itself cannot close the gaps in the labor market. So the closure of education gaps doesn't translate in the closure of labor market gaps. So something else is happening here. One of the major things holding back women from full equality is the disproportionate burden of unpaid care and domestic work that falls on their shoulders. There is no country in the world, as we can see in this graph, where men perform more of this kind of work than women. Worldwide, women spend more than 3 more hours a day performing unpaid care work compared to men, while men spend more than 2 hours a day doing paid work than women. So we have these two types of persons specializing in 2 different jobs, non-paid and paid. So the ones that are specializing in unpaid jobs, they are going to be very, very vulnerable, and they are going to have a lower power of negotiation within households. Well, I really like this graph because this graph compares mothers with non-mothers and fathers with non-fathers. The yellow bars show the penalty for motherhood, and the bigger the number, the bigger the penalty. And we can see here that for women, almost in all countries, having a kid is going to represent a penalty, while for men, it's going to represent a price. Here we have this negative value. So they are going to be perceived very different. Men are going to be perceived, fathers are going to be perceived as a positive trait in the labor market, while for women that is going to be a negative characteristic to be a mother. I really like this graph here, Beneria et al. 2016, that analyzed this trade-off between paid and unpaid work. They compute women's share of hours worked in unpaid work and market relative to the couple total hours for 3 countries. So in Ghana, which represents the low-income country, even if the woman here brings all the income to the household, she still performs 80% of the unpaid work, household. In Mexico, it's a little bit better, but even if females bring all the income to home here, they still face more work at home than their partners. There's a bigger reduction in the border of domestic and care work for women in France, but I really want you to see this difference. If the woman doesn't work at all in an unpaid work, she still must assume 90% of the housework at home. In contrast, if the man doesn't work outside home, he only has to perform 50% of the housework. And this is for a developed country in which it seems that women have more power of negotiation. Still, it's not, it doesn't look that they are that they have a lot of room to divide the work equally. Policies aimed at reducing gender disparities should encourage women participation and eradicate labor market barriers. But at the same time, they have to reduce, redistribute, and recognize the border of unpaid care and domestic work. Finally, gender stereotypes also hold women back in their workplace. This graph shows the result of the perception survey that asks people the following question. When jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women, and the agree rates are really high, showing that there is a generalized conception that men are more suitable for paid work than women. The gender norms that segregate women to the domestic sphere are a vast obstacle for women's empowerment. Bertrand et al. 2015 find that couples where wife earn more than the husband are less satisfied with their marriage and are more likely to get a divorce. Based on the information provided by time use surveys, they are also facing a bigger gap in non-market work. What is the meaning of this? When a woman doesn't meet the stereotypes of earning less than men, she can continue with her marriage only if she compensates by performing a lot of housework. So this is important because it shows that social norms impose a border of care in women, whether if she has time or not. Also, Floro and Komatsu, 2011, a study on employed men and women in South Africa. Women use their time for unpaid work, while men have more time for searching a job and undertake some paid jobs, allowing them to survive. So the evolution of social norms toward more egalitarian gender roles can induce both a better redistribution of unpaid work and a greater female participation in the labor force. Public policy must aim to modify social norms that act as barriers towards gender equality. Well, one way to encourage women labor force participation and foster gender equality is to implement policies that help women who are the primary caregivers to balance paid work and family. UNICEF classified family-friendly policy into three types: time-related, service-related, and finance-related. Time-related policies are those like maternity leave, paternal leave, breastfeeding breaks, flexible working hours, telecommuting. Services-related policies include affordable, accessible, and quality childcare services. And finance-related policies are those that provide cash benefits and grants for the care of children, as Ito was talking about some of these finance-related policies. Family-friendly policies have a critical role in countering the disadvantage women face while promoting women economic empowerment. Family-friendly policy may consider women different roles and needs, and I think this is key because sometimes in the workplace, when people talk about gender equality, they are saying that we have to erase all these differences. We have to decide that everyone is equal, but that is not the way to proceed because we are not equal in certain ways. So we have to be aware of these inequalities. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible to solve all these problems for women to go further in their careers. After the countries started measuring unpaid work and researchers pointed out unpaid work as the essential driver of gender inequality, proposals on dealing with inequality in unpaid work began to be explored. Addressing unpaid work has three interconnected dimensions: recognition, reduction, and redistribution, sometimes referred as the 3 R's. Recognition is measuring time used in household and integrating them into the national statistical systems. This is measuring, because if you don't measure, you are not going to know what is happening. For example, during the pandemic, the National Institute of Statistics in Colombia released some data about time use in Colombia. And you can see that women during the pandemic are doing 4 more hours a day in passive care, while men are doing 48 minutes a day. So you can have the data to understand the difference. Otherwise, it's very difficult to show what the inequalities within home. Reduction is to reduce the burden on women by expanding access to care infrastructure for care and investing in time and labor saving technologies. For example, investment in water, sanitation, electricity, and transport are critical in the developing countries to liberate some of the time of women. Redistribution is to redistribute unpaid work, but sometimes this redistribution is seen that it's all only for men and women, and it is, but also with the government and also with the private sector. So here all the policies include quality public care services, help to redistribute care between families and government, for example. So eliminated gender wage gaps could also foster redistribution of care work within the household. If women earn more than men, or at least the same, the opportunity cost of women trading market work for care work raises. So there's an interesting policy in UK where they have to really, the corporate sector has to release the wage gap. So this makes that they have to do an effort to reduce these gaps, because you don't want to be the worst one. And this effort will help to balance better the market for women, but also to give them a better power of negotiation within home. Family-friendly policies could promote women in the labor market. So here we have this graph that show a positive correlation between employment and family benefits. There's also very different policies that have been implemented in the countries, but at least this gives us a sense that it worth to invest in care infrastructure and family benefits. Well, let's see some policies aiming to solve this problem between unpaid care and paid work. Olivetti and Petrangolo studied different family-friendly policies established in the United States to see which ones affected the labor outcomes for women. Most estimates range from negligible to a small positive impact. But the verdict is far more favorable when estimated the beneficial impacts of spending on early education and childcare infrastructure. Here, and this one. They observed that investing in infrastructure for childcare will set free the time of mothers. This time liberation translates into more paid hours, increasing women's labor supply. So the result of this paper is that the most effective policy was to invest in childhood education. Today, during the pandemic, we're experiencing a reversal. There is a shortage of childcare services, and you also can see the woman withdrawing from the market. This research conducted by Cleven et al. Shows the labor market consequences of having a children for women and men in 6 developed countries with a range of policies and norms. The general trend here is that women experience a large, immediate, and persistent drop in earnings. You can see here, this is for different countries here. While men are essentially unaffected. This line that doesn't move, this is men. The red line is when they had the baby. Despite these similarities, this graph also reveals some striking differences. The penalties for the Scandinavian countries are lower than for the English-speaking countries and the German-speaking countries. So this analysis reveals some striking similarity across the countries, but sharp differences in the magnitude of the effects, highlighting the potential of role of family policies and gender norms in explaining the cross-country effects. So we know that Scandinavian countries have this bundle of policies encouraging men to participate in the care of their children. Also, they have more sense of equality where employers see mothers as peers, and this reduces the discrimination toward mothers and therefore reduce their penalty. We can conclude that family-friendly policies always help. Sometimes they can backfire. For example, longer maternity leave raises the cost for employers of hiring women of childbearing age. My paper with other co-authors estimate the impact of extending the maternity leave from 12 to 14 weeks on female labor outcomes. The extension resulted in a deterioration of working conditions for women of childbearing age. It increases the probability of inactivity, informality, self-employment, and even when compared with men same age, wages went down. So here we compare women ages 18 to 30 relative to men same age and women ages 40 to 55. And we saw this deterioration of the condition for the younger women. This paper proposed at the end a shared leave for both mother and fathers that must have the same duration. That way, fathers can be involved in the care, because if you only give them the maternity leave to women, you are defining that that's the person who is going to take care of the baby. Also, it also a signal that that person is going to be more costly than other person. The evidence suggests the policy aiming to encourage fathers to take parental leave could help to improve women's work conditions, only if these policies are correctly designed and used and extended as intended. This paper of Scott Saddam and Finereas find that in Norway, after giving 4 weeks of exclusive paternity leave, respondents whose children were born just after the reform report a reduction in couple conflicts due to the division of labor at home. Also, they report an increase in the probability of dividing homework equally, such as doing laundry, compared to respondents who had their children just before the reform. But also, it's important to design well these kind of policies, because it also can backfire. There's another paper, I think called et al. 2016, that showed that the adoption of 1 year of leave for parents before the promotion to tenure in universities, to be a tenure professor, substantially reduced female tenure rates while substantially increased male tenure rates. The author explained that this may happen due to the fact that fathers work on their research during the license. So that 1 more year allows them to have advantage over everyone, while the mothers were using this leave to attend their children, and they continue to be the primary caregivers. So this put them in a disadvantage compared to the rest of the group. Flexible work is believed to foster gender equality. One of the great work flexibility experiments in work hours occurred during the pandemic, no? Alon et al. Argue that increase the access to telecommuting and other forms of flexibility has the potential to reduce gender inequality in the labor market drastically. So we have these 2 graphics from this paper, Alon et al. 2020. The one in the right shows the gender gap in employment for people with and without kids. With is the blue one, and without kids is the red one. This graph compares the US in the current COVID crisis recession, the lines, versus the Great Recession, the dotted lines. When the change is negative, it means that there was worse outcome for women. The gender gap in the current crisis has the most significant impact on mothers. You can see here. The gap is bigger for mothers. However, among telecommuters, this gender gap was smaller. So working from home is here to stay, and added flexibility can reduce career family conflicts and benefit working women. Nevertheless, this is only going to work if we divide equally or more equally the housework between men and women. Looking at the second graph, women's employment declined more than men in most high-income countries, but the message underneath this graph is that policies do matter. Because for countries with limited school closures, the reduction was small. Well, so these are some of the papers that analyze some of policies, address this disadvantage that women have, especially because of the unpaid work that they have to take over all the time. That is a task that relies disproportionately on them. But then let's see some other policies. These policies that we are going to talk about are the policies aiming to modify the workplace environment that could also promote equality. There are several barriers inside the workplace that sometimes are not perceptible, but prevent women to advance in their careers. Many countries around the world implemented gender quotas in their political system, but the gender quotas in the work sectors are not quite common. They are even controversial, even if we have also these disparities, huge disparities in the labor market. Bertrand et al. 2017 studied the effects of these quotas. These graphics show that with the quotas, the new reserved seats are filled with better qualified women than women who were appointed before the quota, and that with the quotas, the less qualified men were displaced. The gender gap in earnings fell as the board became more diverse, mainly because the high salaries of the women in the boards. But the tricky thing here is that there was no benefit for female employees of companies that are not part of the board. So this reform helped women to get into the top, but doesn't trickle down. There is still a lot of work to do on this area, but perhaps promoting more pro-woman candidates could be something that could help to have these spillovers effects from the board to other ranks. The difficulties associated with providing and addressing gender discrimination in hiring processes has been crucial to promote more diverse workplaces over the past few decades. For example, to overcome gender bias hiring, a vast majority of symphony orchestras revised their hiring practices. Several orchestras adopted blind auditions where screens are used to conceal the identity and gender of the musician from the jury, opening up this hiring process to a range of candidates. As a result of these changes, Goldin and Rose 2000 find that most orchestras now hire more new female players. The message behind this paper is try to make recruiting process more transparent and gender blind. We know that everyone has implicit bias. So a way to reduce it is trying to make this process more transparent. On the other hand, these gender equality seals and friendly policies at the workplace could also promote equality. Moreover, they could lead to a more diverse and inclusive environment. The underrepresentation of women is perhaps nowhere as visible as in central banks. I worked in a central bank for 15 years, so this is completely true. Ospido et al. 2019 analyzed the wage progression of men and women over their careers at the European Central Bank. The wage gap in favor of men emerged within a few years of hiring. One of the crucial drivers of this difference is the presence of children. Women were also less likely to be promoted to a higher salary band until 2010, when the bank released a statement about equality and implemented a policy encouraging women to start thinking about going further in their careers. The usual rhetoric in the central banks about the problems that they face in gender equality is that women prefer to distance themselves from promotion, especially the mothers. Well, this is not the case. And I really like this paper because they show that this change in diversity policies had a substantial effect on gender differences in promotion of outcomes. You can see here. It was before and after the implementation of the policy. This is the gender gap in the probability of being in a higher salary band. Therefore, the lower promotion of women was not a matter of women. It was a matter of the bank culture. It just took a policy of equality to change this divergent path between men and women. Okay. So now I was showing you some of the policies that have been implemented in the workplace to reduce the barriers for women. Let's go to the next type of policies, the ones that aim to change some social norms. I really like this paper. It's a paper that goes through all the social norms that prevent women from achieving professional success. So this is just a summary of these social norms, but these social norms that are perversive for women are harassment and violence toward women in public spaces, restrictions placed on women's social interactions and freedom of movement, control over household finances, intimate partner violence, and who should be the family breadwinner. As we see, there's a huge problem of, even for the United States, with the first paper that I was talking about, when women earn more than men. And who bears the responsibility of household chores and childcare? All these social norms limit the ability of women to develop professionally and deter women from participating in the labor force, from both sides, the demand and the supply side. Implementing policies and programs designed to attempt this norm is one way to foster female employment. For example, in this paper, they were talking about the social norms that limit women's ability to interact with men. And they proposed that in that case, programs that enable home-based work or enable women to network with other women easily could be helpful. But I think that maybe at the beginning, this could be a good policy, but you also have to start changing the norms, because I don't see a segregated work as the solution. And I will go to talk about this later on. This other paper, Blau and Kahn, do find that the pay gap is explained by educational and occupational segregation. But after exposing the pay gap between men and women, there is a persistent and significant portion of the gap that is unexplained by the observables. While discrimination can explain some of this, there's some papers that attempt to test whether these gender differences in personality traits or not cognitive skills could provide also an explanation of this. Men are found to place a higher value on money, have higher self-esteem, be less risk-averse, more competitive, self-confident compared to women. And all these traits could be rewarded more in the labor market. But also, the labor market may reward the same traits differently for men and women. There's a paper here, the Manning and Swafford, 2008, that showed that ambition may be seen as a positive trait for men, but a negative trait for women. The notable finding in this table here that we have here is that in each case for these papers, the gender differences in psychological factors account for a small to a moderate portion of the gender pay gap. So there's something here about these non-cognitive skills. So we can foster some of these attributes in women, for example, I think that is positive to allow women to be more confident, and we can work in this since childhood. But nevertheless, not all these are unambiguously positive and promote better workplace environment. So I think here we have to be careful. We can promote some of these traits in men and women, but the idea is not to fix women and make everyone to look like men. The idea is to create inclusive workplace cultures and fix the system. To go deeper in this point, let's observe this distribution right here of the general risk attitudes for a particular sample in this research conducted by Domet et al. 2011. Each bar indicates the fraction of individuals choosing a given number on the 11-point risk scale. The figure reveals substantial heterogeneity in risk attitudes across the population, and the modal response is 5. This order showed this same thing for women and men. These are women, these are men. So the thing that we can see here is that women are clearly more risk averse than men, no? And firms can value risk takers more than non-risk takers. But I want to ask a question and leave this question open. Is it better to take risks all the time or play it safe all the time? I'm not sure that you have to play always to take risks. The other paper that is related to this is the Apicella et al. 2017 that find that while women are less willing to compete against other people than men, they don't find any gender differences in the willing to compete against one's own previous score. This is very interesting, since the inequalities resulting for women shying away from the competitive settings could be easily solved by changing the competitive features of the environment. Another question I want to ask here, do we need to compete with each other all the time? Or instead, an alternative could be to become a better version of ourselves with time and effort? I think this approach could be fascinating and could foster teamwork, reduce all these toxic environments, and all these health problems such as frustration, comparing to everyone constantly, and this anxiety. And all our system is including this constant competence against each other. Look just at the universities. The universities, being in our university is a constant competition with your peers. I don't think that is healthy. It's better to try to be better, and everyone is going to have their time to learn and to become a better version of themselves. I don't think that we have to compete all the time. Here again, we observe some policies aimed to change social norms that can backfire. Some policies point out to segregate men and women to allow women labor participation and deal with social norms. Given that men are more violent than women, individuals that advocate for gender segregation argue that these segregation policies may reduce crimes against women. This paper, with some co-authors, we investigate the link between gender and crime using information from a gender-based lockdown policy in Colombia during the pandemic. Under this policy, men were allowed out on odd days and women on even days. So we had a segregated world outside. Our key findings are that the crimes rates are higher during the gender-based lockdown. On the men's day, the violence exacerbates. And on the women's day, we found an increase in sexual violence. So we were thinking that maybe this is because women were walking without a companion and this is an insecure city in Colombia, and criminals don't follow or respect any of the rules. So they are not going to follow the lockdown and neither to not hurt anyone, no? So taking this together, our research suggests that gender segregation, if anything, tends to increase crimes. We also find some evidence of similar evidence of gender segregation in the schools, that when reducing the proportion of girls in the classroom is going to increase the disruption and violence among males. So we can conclude that we don't need a segregated world, but we need to allow diversity and promote inclusion as we embrace our differences. In this class, we'll review some policies to promote equality in the labor market. All these policies have to simultaneously attack 7 fronts: barriers in the labor market, the disproportionate unpaid care and domestic work that women have, and the social norms that prevent women to advance in their career. And we also explore some of the papers studying these kinds of policies, and we can see that some policies can help women to advance, but others can backfire if they are poorly designed. So let's have a discussion. I'm going to stop sharing. And I want to have to let you talk and collect questions and comments, and at the end have some time to address some of them